Welcome to Artcasters, episode 414. We've got Josh Allen with us tonight. Sorry for the delay. We had a couple of audio issues that we had to work through. But before we introduce Josh, let's introduce ourselves. So you can catch my stuff at coreykerr.com. I am writing a book live and in the public right now, and so if you want to follow along with those chapters as they're released, you can go to coreykerr.com/email and jump onto the Substack. I was going to have a chapter out last week, which I have written, but I haven't recorded it yet. So it should be coming out soon. So jump onto that. And Joshua Kimble, where can we find your stuff?
You can find my stuff at Joshua Kimble on YouTube, as well as two stories. My novel deals with faith and mental illness in an autobiographical and hopefully meaningful way. And then there's also Jacob's Apartment, which is a graphic novel that's a doomed romance story in the vein of Ghost World mixed with Eternal Sunshine for the Spotless Mind. So if you kind of put those two in a blender and you like that flavor, you would probably like Jacob's Apartment. And also, I want to second Corey's suggestion, because I finally caught up on his story, and it is awesome and very Corey Kerr. Like it's awesome, but also like wildly complicated and cool, and also has a lot of like history and interesting science and stuff in it. So yeah, you guys got to check it out. It's pretty wild. I can't compare it to anything that exists, which is a pretty good sign. So
That's my goal, is to be completely unrelatable.
It's relatable, just it's unique. I like it a lot. And there's a little bit of Douglas Adams-ness to like the way you're
yeah,
driving things too. So yeah,
that's high praise. Scott, where can we find your stuff?
You can find my videos on my YouTube channel, and what I'm doing on YouTube is I'm taking vintage nostalgia stuff from like ephemera that you would find or you order from the back of a comic book. And then I'm recreating it, figure out how it works, reverse engineer it, and creating something new out of it. And I actually have a new video that's going to be dropping tomorrow. So tomorrow, if anyone is unfamiliar, is Alien Day, which is a made-up holiday that 20th Century Fox came up to market the movie Alien. But it's called that because 426 LV-426 was the planet that they landed on. So that's the significance there. So I've got a video that has something to do with Alien, but again, it's involving some retro stuff it's crazy. Just trust me. So check that out. Be on the lookout for that tomorrow. Other than that, you can go to my website, circworks.com, where I have my comic books, Young and the Dead. It's a kids versus zombie adventure story. It's kind of like Goonies meets Night of the Living Dead. And then I've got wax packs and prints and all kinds of other stuff available there. The other thing is, speaking of made-up holidays to market movies, May the 4th, sorry, May the 4th be with you. Star Wars Day is also free comic book day, and I'll be at Surprise Comics in Surprise, Arizona, doing signings, probably doing some Star Wars sketch covers because it's Star Wars and everything. So if you happen to be in Arizona, then come out and see me.
Cool. And so Josh Allen, I'll let you introduce yourself in a second, but I first became aware of Josh. When were you doing, I think it was for your first book, and you did like a library reading. I think it probably was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, maybe a little bit longer.
Yeah, my first book came out in 2019. So
okay.
We're going on almost 5 years now. 4.5, 5 years ago is when my first book came out. And I did an event at the public library where we live. And then apparently that's where you figured out who I was.
Yeah. My daughter became an instant fan and reads both of those books. And anyway, when I was looking for guests, she said, "You've got to have Josh Allen on." And then now she's gone through your books and she's like, these are the best stories, and she's starred the stories in the table of contents. But yeah, so tell us where we can find your stuff, and then we'll kind of jump into talking about writing horror for children.
Yeah, people can learn about my stuff on my website, joshallenwriter.com. And I've published 2 books. My first book, Out to Get You, 13 Tales of Weirdness and Woe, came out in 2019. My second book came out in 2021, Only If You Dare. There they are, 13 Stories of Darkness and Doom. These are collections of horror stories for children. I write what's called middle grade fiction. Middle grade fiction is for kids aged like 8 to 13, kind of in that range, those middle grades, not quite high school, not quite elementary school, kind of there in between. I say horror stories, they're kind of zany and quirky. I've got a story about like a haunted bowl of oatmeal in a nasty microwave. I've got a story about the children who were trapped in the school crossing sign, the yellow and black school crossing sign shaped like a house. I've got a story about the boy and the girl who were trapped in that school crossing sign. I've got a story about the haunted paper towel dispenser in the boys' bathroom, that kind of stuff. Books have been reviewed by the Wall Street Journal, Booklist, Kirkus Reviews, and I have a third book coming out. It's finished. The third book comes out August 20th. It's titled Once They See You, 13 Stories to Shiver and Shock, and all of my books are illustrated by the brilliant Sarah J. Coleman. So, Corey, I wonder if you could just open up to one of Sarah's illustrations, just kind of flip through at random. We'll show some of Sarah's work in there. Yeah, there we go. So there's a creepy tree and a couple of doomed children.
Yeah, I just finished rereading. I've read both of these, but I just finished rereading the Vanishers.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think that was the one that I said, which one if I only had 10 or 15 minutes, which one should I read? And Scarlett said, oh, you got to read the Vanishers, which is fun. So I've read two or three of the stories again in the last 48 hours. So tell me about what do you focus in? I was listening to. I took a course from this comic book writer Scott Snyder that does horror, and he also does Batman and other types of things. And he was focusing in on he has a fear or a concern, and then he builds a story around that. Like he became a father, and then he started freaking himself out about oh, am I going to be a good dad? And he did a whole Batman run on whether Batman was a good dad, to his wards or whatever. Do you start with the fear first? Do you go on a walk and see a Children's Crossing sign and build something off of that, or how do you kind of craft these stories?
For me, it almost always starts with an image rather than starting with the fear. I'm really interested in taking things that we don't typically think of as creepy and trying to reveal the phantasmagoric possibilities within those things, like a bowl of oatmeal, a paper towel dispenser, a school crossing sign. There's a story in my book that comes out in August about a spooky Pop-Tart. So so my whole, what I'm really interested in is the idea that, there are these monsters out there that we know are out to get us, right? Vampires and werewolves and whatever. But what about the things we never think about, right? What about the things that look innocent? What if they're really not innocent, right? What if those things, school crossing signs, microwaves, bowls of oatmeal, paper towel dispensers, what if these are the real monsters in the world and we never pay any attention to them at all? And it's because we let our guard down that they end up getting the kids in my stories, right? And so I'm interested in kind of what I want. I want kids, after they read one of my stories about the haunted paper towel dispenser in the boys' bathroom, the next time a kid's in the bathroom and they wave their hand in front of a haunted paper towel dispenser, I want them to see that paper towel dispenser differently. I want them to look at street signs differently. I want them to look at oatmeal and microwaves and all these ordinary things differently. One of the jobs of literature is to wake us up to the world around us. I think horror is a good tool for doing that. You can turn something horrific and then wake people up to looking at it in a way they maybe never have before.
Yeah, basically you want to do for oatmeal what Josh did for sharks.
There you go. Exactly. That's the dream, man.
Yeah, the oatmeal one is pretty gross.
Probably the grossest story I've ever written. It's pretty gross.
Yeah, yeah, that one was funny. I don't want to give any spoilers away, but it's pretty disgusting at the end. You had kind of an interesting breakdown on Stranger Things that I really appreciated, because I really enjoyed the first few seasons of Stranger Things, and then for me there was a switch, and not being into horror, I didn't have like the language to kind of describe what I didn't like about it. But you mentioned that in season 4 they switched to like body horror.
Yeah.
Whereas before it was more, suspense, and it was a little bit more playful. So is there a line that you like to not cross, to stuff that's ultra gory or might be R-rated or stuff, for the age group that you're going in? Is there a line, or do you just kind of feel it out? And if there is a line, how did you decide where that is?
Well, I'm not interested in blood and gore when I sit down to write. That doesn't give me a charge in any way. But atmospheric horror, like the first season of Stranger Things, so much of the horror is atmospheric, right? With the weird falling snow and the darkness and the upside down and all of this, the flickering lights, right? There's all of this atmospheric horror, which I think is just full of anticipation. And like you mentioned, season 4 kind of switches over and relies a lot more on body horror, snapping bones, exploding eyes, this kind of stuff. And there's not as much, that's not as pregnant. That kind of horror is not as pregnant. It's not as like full of possibility, right? Once we know the monster just wants to like snap you in half, that's not as interesting to me. I feel like what's more horrifying is the question of, where's this monster come from? What's it going to do? And so for me, for kids, when I write for kids, I'm not interested in blood. I'm not interested in gore. So I don't really, even when I sit down to write, have to worry about that, because it's not something that I would do anyway. And I think when you write for children, I think the first rule of writing for children is don't condescend to children. Children.
I was about to ask that. Yeah.
Children are tough, right? I mean, kids today, they lived through the pandemic. Most of them know somebody that died in the middle of the pandemic. They know what's going on in the Ukraine. They vaguely know what's going on in Palestine and Israel. They know what happened to George Floyd, right? They know all of this, right? Kids are not naive. And so the idea that today's kids can't handle a story about a spooky Pop-Tart is so condescending to today's children, right? Today's children are like incredibly tough and incredibly resilient, and they've seen so much of the world. We maybe don't shield children today. It's maybe with the internet and Instagram and TikTok, it's maybe harder to shield children from some of the harsh realities of the world that exist today than maybe it was 30, 40 years ago when I was a kid. Kids today, they've been through it. They know the world is a scary place. And horror stories, I think, are a good way to be honest with kids, right? And to say, okay, yeah, there's no such thing as vampires. There's no such thing as haunted microwaves. But kids know that the world is a scary place filled with potential dangers that they have to navigate. And so I've had a lot of kids tell me that the books feel honest, even though it's completely made up stuff. But thanks for writing an honest book, right? Or they don't use the word authentic. But that's kind of what I think they're getting at, right? It feels real to them, even though it's all made up. Because finally, kids read horror, and I think they feel like this person's telling me a truth about the world, that it's a scary place. So we don't need to condescend to children by kind of like hedging on things that are scary, because they know the world's scary.
Yeah, it's interesting because go ahead.
Sorry, that kind of reminds me of like Sendak kind of famously talked about, like somebody was asking him how he wrote so effectively for the little kids. He's writing picture books, and he was like, he's like, I just don't pretend that they're like good. He's like, little kids are little like not just like little monsters, but they process a lot of things. They have bad thoughts and good thoughts. They're not all selfless. They're not always angelic. And when you're a little kid, like just like what you were describing, where it's like as a little kid, you kind of know that when adults are sugarcoating something, you're being force fed something. And so he was saying he just never condescended or wrote down to kids. He just remembered what it was like to be a kid. And he even criticized like modern publishers for forgetting what it's like to be a kid, being like, wow, I don't know if a kid can handle, a story where like, because I guess when Where the Wild Things was pitched, it was the same thing where people were just like, I don't know, this is like Run Away from Home. This is pretty heavy stuff. Like, I don't know if a kid can handle it.
Hasn't thought about running.
And it's like
Running Away from Home.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a classic book, and it's like, as a kid, I loved that book, and the monsters were a little scary when you'd see them when you're really little, but it's like, it's kind of awesome, and I always appreciated that about that book. It wasn't like sugar-coated. So anyhow, that just reminded me of that. I wonder if that's a common thread among people who write for young adults, and then secondly, I wonder if that's a common thing you're like pushed away from by people who are kind of ignorant to like the way to write to kids. I don't know. Do you get grief for out of curiosity, have you gotten a hard time for writing children's horror from people who might just be like, I don't know if kids can handle being scared? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there've been a couple schools that I was scheduled to speak at over the last 5 years. There've been a couple of them, 2 or 3, that I was uninvited from when kind of word got out that the school was bringing a children's horror author. One sweet little librarian for the school in Boise, Idaho, had to call me and disinvite me, and she obviously didn't want to do it. She was doing this under duress, right? Had to call.
Oh, wow.
And so I do sometimes get a little bit of grief, because I think there's this idea that what we're supposed to do with children's literature is indoctrinate the youth, right? Children's literature is about indoctrinating the youth to the correct principles, which is one reason I think that like we're having so many fraught political conversations about libraries and what books should be in our libraries.
Right.
And this also feels kind of condescending to children to me. Like, sometimes I'll get an email from a school librarian that'll say something like, I have parents who are challenging not just your books, but lots of children's horror books in the library, trying to get them removed. Is there anything you want me to like say in defense of your books? Is there anything you want me to, any arguments I could make to like argue that your book should be kept in the library? And what I always say to like librarians when they reach out to me is, well, don't defend me, right? I don't need to be defended. And don't defend my books. They don't need to be defended. In those situations, the thing we ought to be defending is children, right? Yeah. Because the people who are trying to say we have to get these books out of the library, they're seeing children as these like delicate, fragile teacups that are going to shatter if they read a spooky story. As if like 60 years from now, there are going to be people sitting in armchairs in rest homes going, it all fell apart when I read scary stories to tell the dark.
Yeah.
That was the beginning of the end. Like, those people don't exist.
My life was going great until I couldn't use a paper towel dispenser anymore. Handicapped for life from that. Yeah, that is a really interesting point, and it also makes I think those of us who are making books really appreciate librarians out there, right? Who are kind of pushing for keeping books in libraries. But that's a good point. That I never even thought of taking that angle, where not only is that like bad for the art form of books and stuff like that, but it's worse. It's horrible for kids. That's a really good point.
Yeah. What are we saying that we believe children are when we say to children, you can't handle this?
Yeah.
And so again, my sort of theme on this: don't defend me, don't defend my books, defend kids. right? Stand up for the strength and resilience and courage of today's kids, because they are those things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the most popular children's TV shows right now is Bluey, and they tackle crazy topics for a kids show. And my kids from 2 years old to 14-year-old love that show, and they're talking about infertility, they're talking about divorce, they're talking about death, they're talking about the fear of losing your job. You know, they're talking about. I mean, at one point in time, it's kind of veiled, but I was I walked into the room and I'm like, are Bluey's parents hungover right now? And they're like, yeah, they had a party last night or whatever. It was like, but it's not like Ren and Stimpy where it's really like shoving it down their throat. It's like delivered in a way that kids will understand, like through play and those types of things. But they're not shying away from, like you're saying, the subjects that kids today are dealing with and grappling with in their real life. So that leads me to a question. I mean, obviously, you're going to be authentic because of who you are, right? You are naturally going to gravitate towards not being dishonest or condescending. But is there anything specific that you do in the way that you write or in the way that you craft those stories to make sure that lands with that realness, with that authenticity?
I spend a lot of time thinking about what it was like to be a 12-year-old. So I spend a lot of time going back to Oker Hills Middle School in Riverton, Utah. Not physically, well, I've been back physically, but I go back there in my head and try to remember what it was like to be a kid. I'm 50 years old, and the day I forget what it was like to be a kid is the day all of this stops, right? It's the day that my writing stops working. Another thing that I do, there's a school teacher in the town where I live, Rexburg, Idaho, a fourth grade teacher who I kind of have a standing invitation with, where whenever I kind of have a story that I'm ready to test out on kids, she lets me come to her class, read it to the kids, and they're kind of my guinea pigs, right? I read the story,
nice.
Pay really close attention to whether the kids laugh at the jokes, whether they get the shivers when I want them to get the shivers, whether the suspense builds in the way that I want it to. So I kind of have this built-in audience because this fourth grade teacher is a good friend of mine and lets me come to her class kind of whenever I feel like it. So those are some ways that I try to stay grounded in the space that children occupy. As a children's author, I also get to visit a lot of schools. I speak at a lot of schools to kids about bravery and creativity and writing and storytelling. And I'll usually show up at a school embarrassingly early. And I kind of do this on purpose so that I can just take 20 or 30 minutes, sit in a corner and watch children interact with one another. So I can try to remember what it's like to be a child, and I can observe how children, how they file into the lunchroom, how they talk, how they whisper secrets to their friends, what they seem to be afraid of, the anxiety they feel as they walk into the auditorium and are trying to navigate who they're going to sit by at the assembly that I'm about to give. Paying really close attention to children in these spaces is a huge part of my process. And so those are kind of the main things I do to keep myself grounded in the universe that I'm writing about.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I like that a lot. I mean, that's good. That's good advice for writing as well as marketing or anything. Anytime that you think you're different than or better than or other than your audience, like you just immediately start to be disconnected. So in your story, The Vanishers, the kids come up with like a secret language and they're kind of like interjecting that in there. Is that directly related to something that you experienced as a child, or is that something that you've observed through watching kids?
Oh, I definitely, as a kid, tried to like make up a secret language that just me and my best friends would understand, and then so we could, say these things to each other in front of our teachers or around other kids, and we'd have our own little secret club. And I noticed my own kids doing this. I have 4 kids of my own, and I think all of my 4 kids at one point or another has kind of come up with some like code that they could pass notes in to their friends, or secret language, or inventing words. And I think this is kind of maybe I'm wrong about this, but that feels like a staple of childhood to me, is trying to use language to set the boundaries of your peer group. And sometimes in my story, I try not to let it come off as kind of exclusive. It comes off more as a thing that these 2 best friends have that bonds them together, rather than sometimes in childhood, I feel like that's almost used to say, like, we are the cool kids, we have this shared language. But I didn't want it to feel like that in my story. I wanted it to feel more like bonding in my story.
Yeah, and to me in the story, it felt like every time I've seen that happen, it's trying to distance yourself, separate yourselves, or covertly kind of fly under the radar from the adults. And that was kind of like what was happening in the story, is that they figured out a way to talk, because they got caught passing notes in class. And so now it's like, so that was interesting. In that story as well, to kind of come back to this, there's a very real fear. And I don't know if every child experiences this, but like attention is a commodity, like growing up. Like everybody's doing stuff for attention and trying to get noticed, and we note that you're going to get good attention or bad attention. They just want attention, and if you're not getting the good attention, you're going to act out and do bad things. And that entire story is based around the idea of, well, what if you just disappeared? Or what if you disappeared so effectively that no one ever remembered that you ever even existed? Like, that's a real deep-seated fear for kids, I think, to like not be known or not be looked at or not be noticed, like to be invisible. I'm kind of curious, is that you said that everything starts with a picture. Did that one start with an image, or did that come from somewhere else, that particular story?
The story of how that story came to be, it's a little longer, so bear with me here for a second. But I used to be an assistant scoutmaster in the Boy Scouts of America. Some people in my community approached me and said, "We need you to do this." And I wasn't at the time a huge fan of the Boy Scouts of America program. I had some philosophical problems with it. I tried to explain these, and a friend of mine said to me, "Look, we just need somebody to keep children alive in the woods. Can you do that?" And I said, "Yeah, I can probably keep the kids alive in the woods." And I did. We didn't lose a one. And that story is about 2 boys named Jacob. One spells his name Jacob, and one spells his name Jakob. And in my scout troop, there were 2 boys named Jacob. One spelled his name Jacob, one spelled his name Jakob. These 2 boys who were in my scout troop, they were my backyard neighbors. Like, their backyards butted up against my backyards. And it was just really creepy that there were these 2 boys named Jacob. One, his name was spelled slightly differently than the other, and they lived next door to each other, and they looked alike, and they liked all the same things. I'd go out in my backyard to like grill up some hamburgers or something, and I'd see the Jacobs jumping on a trampoline, or climbing on a backyard shed or something. And so when I started writing spooky stories for kids, I just thought, someone ought to do something about this. This is creepy. It's weird. So I guess it kind of did start with an actual image, but in this case, the image was these like 2 next door neighbor boys who had this same name with 1 letter off and looked alike. And that just felt like a foundation for like creepiness to follow. And so yeah, that's kind of where that one came from. They actually asked me, I used to read books to the kids up at scout camp to try and get them to go to sleep at the end of the day. I would read stories to them to try and like let literature soothe the savage beasts, so they wouldn't stay up till like 3 a.m. And we read a bunch of stuff. We read some Neil Gaiman. We read some Gary Schmidt. I read some Edgar Allan Poe, some H.P. Lovecraft. And one scout camp, one of the boys named Jacob said, "You're a writer, aren't you?" And I said, "Well, yeah." And he said, "You should read us something that you wrote at the next camp out." And so I wrote that story because one of the boys named Jacob asked me to. And so that was kind of right. That was like an intentional gift that I tried to create for these two kids that lived in the neighborhood, were friends with my son, and shared this name in this creepy way.
Yeah, that's cool. I like that. How do you choose which stories make it into the books? Is your third book also 13 stories?
13, that's the lucky number.
Yeah, that seems intentional. Yeah. How do you choose what makes it in, what doesn't make it in? And in addition to that, how do you choose the order? How do you choose what you start with and what follows that? Is there any thematic kind of throughput or decisions in the ordering of those stories?
Yeah, okay, so to the first question, how do I choose which stories end up in the book? I have a really great editor. Her name's Sally Morgridge at Holiday House, and we know, like, the decision to have 13 stories in each book is a decision from the marketing and publicity people at the Holiday House, right? 13 is a creeper number. We can use this in Halloween marketing and things like that. And so that's obviously what's going on there. But I always write with each book way more than 13 stories. With my first book, I started with 32 stories that my agent helped me pare the 32 down to the best 19. And then my editor and I pared those 19 down to the first 13. And for my second book, 2 of the stories that were deleted from my first book ended up in my second book, and then I wrote a whole bunch more. I think in pursuit of the 13 stories in my second book, I ended up writing about 30 stories as well. Same thing with my third book. My third book, I wrote about 30 stories. So about 2/3 of the stories that I write will probably never make their way into a book. And a lot of it is, there are a lot of questions that we have to ask, like which of these stories are going to resonate the most with kids, which of these stories are linked thematically. Sometimes one of the stories I had to delete out of my book that comes out in August, it was just too similar to one of the other stories that we already decided to include, so it had to go. And so there are a lot of discussions about quality, what's appropriate for the age group, making sure we have a nice variety of stories, but still kind of centered around creepiness for this age group. And as far as ordering the stories go, we consider things like whether the main character is male or female. We don't want to have like 4 or 5 stories in a row where the main characters are all boys or all girls. We want a nice kind of balance and a back and forth going on there. We consider things like point of view. Some of my stories are written in the first person, some of my stories are written in the third person. So we want a nice kind of back and forth between that as well. We consider whether the stories end in doom. Some of the stories end in doom and the children, and it ends badly for them. Some of the stories end in relief. And so we want to kind of go back and forth with stories that end in doom and stories that end in relief. We don't want too many doom together. We don't want too many relief together. And we also consider the length of the stories. Because middle grade readers are, a lot of them, kind of new, younger readers. We want to put the book together in a way that kind of propels them through it. And if you have 3 22-page stories next to each other, that can feel onerous for some reluctant readers. And so we'll sandwich a 22-page story. We'll put like a 5-page story before it and like a 7-page story after it to try and make the experience of reading the book easier for kids. And so there are all these different factors. And so what I do is I write all these things out on note cards, and then I sit down on my floor, 1 note card for each story, and I just shuffle things around again and again until I come up with an order that seems to make sense, that balances those factors nicely. Send that off to my editor, and sometimes she suggests that we tweak things for some reason. But yeah, it's a complex process putting all that together.
So Josh, just out of curiosity, like in that editing process, as a writer, right? Have you got like a small stack of stories you've just never been able to get through, but you just absolutely love out of curiosity? That weren't able to get.
Yeah, there's one story that I tried to get into my first book, it didn't make it. Tried to get into my second book, didn't make it. Tried to get it into my third book, didn't make it. It's a conscious retelling. There's a classic short story by Charlotte Perkins Gilman called "The Yellow Wallpaper," and I wrote like a middle school retelling of the story called "The Yellow Bulletin Board," about a girl that is assigned to sit by a really gross, ugly bulletin board in her class. And I tried again and again to get that story into one of the books, and it just never has really fit. We've never really been able to find the right place for it, and it's maybe doing some things that don't work for the audience that I'm trying to speak to.
That's interesting. I think that's really enlightening too, that you write so many stories. Like, you're writing almost triple the amount of stories for each book of what ends up, after, the cutting room floor or whatever, which is pretty cool and enlightening to kind of the process. You must love. Do you love the process of writing short stories? Have you considered longer stories? Sorry, Corey's gonna obviously get back. I just got curious about that. Have you considered doing longer work, or are you really happy in the lane of short stories?
I'm really passionate about trying to convince kids who are on the fence about reading to be less on the fence about reading. And I think there are a lot of kids out there. There's a lot of 11, 12-year-olds who, if you give them a 250-page book and say, read this, you're going to love it, they're kind of immediately intimidated. They sort of immediately, like, this feels like almost an impossible task, getting through this 250, 300-page book. I write short stories because I feel like it gives kids, and like it bothers me when I hear a kid say, I tried to read that book. Because then the kid's carrying around this sense of failure and attachment to reading. And I don't love that. And so I like the idea of saying to a kid, here's a book of short stories. Read the first one. It's 7 pages. And if you like it, you can read the next one. And if not, you can quit. I want to give kids, like 13 stories means a kid has 13 opportunities to succeed as they're reading this. 13 moments where they can say, I just did this. I just finished this. And they get this sense of accomplishment. And it also gives kids off-ramps that come without any shame. Instead of saying, I tried to read that book, they can say, oh, I read some of those stories. And they can feel a sense of accomplishment, not shame.
That's great. That's actually
so at the moment, I'm pretty committed to short fiction.
I love it.
Are there 13 books of these 13 stories? Are you gonna?
I don't know, man. I've written 3 books in 5 years while holding down a full-time job and raising kids. Please don't ask me about the next project.
When I finished my master's while I was working full-time, my wife immediately asked me, so you're going to get a PhD? And I'm like, how dare you? You even ask me that.
I tell my wife, it's like when she was 8.5 months pregnant and somebody said, how many children are you going to have?
Right, yeah.
That's not the time. Don't ask. Right, yeah.
So what?
So
that
labor to get these things out that it's always a little tough. Once finally seeing light of day to like try to kind of jump forward to like another just year one commitment. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to ask. I'm kind of curious about how you. So this show, I don't know how familiar you are with it, but we talk a lot about art and creativity, and most of the guests that we have on are creators of some ilk, and most of the audience, they're making comics, they're writing short stories, they're doing animations or cartoons, and I go through kind of a weird emotional journey, and I tend to like Joshua Kimble, for example. He works on projects for like 5 years. Like he's gonna, he just sits down and just plows through like a graphic novel for like 5 years straight. The longest thing that I can really handle is like 6 months. It like drives me nuts, and so I tend to do much shorter things. But I go through kind of this interesting cycle. And never having been published by like a big publisher, I'm kind of curious if there's any correlation. But there's kind of that initial excitement with the idea. Then there's the kind of like pushing through to like get it done. There's the completion, which I find has kind of two stages to it, like the satisfaction of completing it, and then there's this like post-project letdown where I was doing something, I was pushing towards something, and then now my life feels somewhat empty or whatever. I'm kind of curious. Add publishing into that mix. What are your kind of emotions and experiences as you are, you're struggling to put this together. It's fulfilling, but it's also difficult. And then there's got to be periods where you are waiting for stuff to happen, where it's going to happen, but you can't talk about it. What's that like?
It's for me. I don't know how it is for all writers, but I know for me, it's really an emotionally volatile process, right? The early stages of the process are sort of, I sort of vacillate back and forth between this like enormous enthusiasm for this thing that I'm making, but also at times a little bit of dread when you look at just how long the road in front of you is. Right? That like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to write 30 stories to get 13 that are publishable, and that just seems like just an insane amount of work. But then you get an idea and you get all fired up and you sit down and you have a lot of fun writing. And so there's just all these highs and lows early in the process. And for me, the deeper I get into the process, the more all-consuming the project becomes. Mm-hmm. Early in the process, I might work for an hour or two a day. And by the end of the process, it's like sort of taken over my life. And like every 3 minutes is working on this project. I finished the next book, the one that comes out in August. I finished it on December 6th, 2023. So just a few months back. And then I remember feeling this sense of euphoria, right? When my editor and I agreed that this is the final draft of the book, it is done. This is the one we're going to send to the printers. And then I had this enormous sense of like, I did it, right? I wrote this third book, it's finished. And within like, I'm not kidding you, within like 20 minutes, I was like, now what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now what am I going to do with my life? Right, Mary Oliver. Now what will I do with my one wild life? And so there was this. It's almost like it's like a mild form of grief, because this thing that has been such a part of your life is like it's done and over now. It's gone.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because like I'm kind of curious. You were talking about kind of the ramping up and stuff. So, do you experience kind of the thing that a lot of creatives experience? I was just talking about this the other day, where the struggle when you're first starting to write, right, is just like the kind of art of war kind of stuff, where it's just like sit down, make the time, write, like. Yeah. And if it's like 30 minutes, whatever, you set a time limit and you go, this is going to be my writing time or my art time or whatever. That's how it gets done. You just show up every day. But and like as you get more seasoned at it, sometimes like what I've found in the last 5 years or so is the opposite struggle of not obsessively spending too much time when I'm deep in a project to where the rest of my life starts kind of collapsing as the story's coming together. I'm curious, how do you juggle kind of the balance of that with family, with all your other obligations, of like kind of getting in that deep end part where you're in the deep end of the pool, like you have all your seeds planted and you're starting to like grow like a thing there. How do you kind of balance, or is there a balance, or is that just like a fiction that's out there? Basically,
Yeah.
you figured out the secret sauce to that, or
No, no, I have not figured out the secret sauce to that. And I mean, I do have to, like, if I'm being purely honest about this, I have to confess that this last book, that ramping up, that last month
Yeah.
or two of working on this book, I mean, it really did become like all consuming. And
Yeah.
I mean, I was going home at the end of the workday and having dinner with my family and trying to spend time with my kids and this kind of thing, but it was not at all
Yeah.
unusual for me. Come home, have dinner, spend a little time with the family, and then say, okay, I'm going back to the office. And I would
Yeah.
stay in the office till 11, 12 o'clock, come home, sleep, get up early, head back to the office. And so it's like, I'm not great at this,
yeah,
but I get asked this question a lot when I do author events. People are like, oh, how do you find balance? And what I've kind of decided is that balance is a myth, right? It's like
yeah,
I don't believe, and it's not even really worth chasing. Like I don't believe that there are these like accountants in the sky who are going to like
Yeah.
deem our lives acceptable once we have found balance. They're like, good
Yeah.
job, you got all the percentages right. So I don't think
Yes.
I think chasing balance is a fool's errand. But I
Ooh,
think
that's
what
a
you
really good
can
point, yeah.
do is I think you can chase joy. Right? So a couple years ago I decided I'm not going to chase balance anymore. Instead I'm going to chase joy. I'm going to do the next thing that will bring me joy. And sometimes the next thing that brings me joy is I'm going to go home and have dinner with my family. Sometimes the next thing that's going to bring me joy, it's going to bring me a lot of joy if I can finish this story this week. So I'm going to do that.
yeah,
Right? Joy is something I can chase. And I believe I can obtain. Balance is not something I can obtain. Right? But joy is. So I try to chase that instead.
That's a really good point. Yeah, it's been interesting coming to grips with the fact that I think we're always kind of going to be a little off balance one way or the other. Like we're, one day I'm a perfect husband and I'm a failed author, and then the next day I'm a great author and I'm a horrible husband. And it's like, or vice versa with like throw in being a father or like teacher or whatever it is. It's like you're kind of like always kind of adding weight to one thing, and it's always at the cost of something else. So I love the idea of what you were describing about like just kind of chasing joy. A really good way to kind of be at peace with that kind of yin and yang of the whole weird thing, like yeah.
I do this with my intentional creativity class, but this is an interesting exercise. If you have the mindset that balance is something that you can achieve, try this. Close your eyes and stand on one foot and then lift up on your toes. Right? And what you'll find is that balance is actually a series of very quick micro adjustments, and sometimes like a big flailing correction or whatever. But like, what I like to think of is there's this guy J. Golden Kimble, who's an old kind of humorist from forever ago, but he said talking about I haven't always been on the straight and narrow path, but I've tried to cross it as many times as I can, and that idea of like, if I get a little out of whack here, then I can make an adjustment, a little out of whack there, because the other thing that's really interesting is there are these times and seasons in our life, and there are times where I should be focusing on my day job, and there are times where I should be focusing on my creative pursuits, and there are times where I really need to focus on one of my kids, or I really need to focus on my wife, or whatever. And I don't think balance is something where you just achieve, as Jim Carrey has said, total spiritual creaminess, but you get into the idea of like being present and aware of like the needs of yourself and those around you, and making those micro adjustments to kind of stay, without getting out of control in one area. Anyway, that's a really kind of physical way that I like to teach my students when I'm talking about creativity. Is it's like it can be a very addictive thing to like get this kind of flow state and get in there, and you need to be aware that too much of that and you lose your job and starve to death and everyone hates you and you've neglected your friends and family, and you've got to kind of like figure out how this is incorporated into an actual livable adult life. That was a conversation killer, apparently.
No, I like that. I was just thinking about also some of the other analogies that could come from that, because I wonder, because and like to me instantly I think of pain if you're balancing that way, and so it's like there's also like maybe a perfectly balanced life is kind of boring and painful. Like so, it's like it's one of those things too, because I do like. No, Josh, the way you described that with the joy thing, I do think like in a weird way there is a part of kind of making art or writing where you just kind of have to embrace like you're not a normie when you're a writer. You're just probably not going to be a normie, because a lot of people want to just go home, turn on the TV, zone out, and consume.
Well, yeah, most people have been
want to go home and create something new at like cost of time and effort and energy. I don't know.
Well,
what do you think?
Most people have bought into the lie that they should be numbed with numbing behavior rather than be present and expressive.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Yeah, what do you think, Josh?
To tie this to Josh, I guess, I wonder if that's the kind of mentality that leads to kind of saccharine horror for kids, like where if you forget what it's like to be a kid, you're kind of bubble coating all the walls, right? It's like or bubble wrap coating the walls. It's comfortable, but it's kind of like, are they getting something from that book, right? If they're just reading a book that's bubble wrapped, are they getting something from it, or are they getting something more out of it where they're like eating their Pop-Tart and they're kind of looking at it strange, like, I don't know about this Pop-Tart anymore. I wonder.
Yeah.
Like there's some thinking there. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I like this. I like the turn this has taken towards the importance of being present, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that's connected to what I'm saying about chasing joy. Because in order to like chase joy, you have to be present enough to understand what is actually going to make you joyful.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes when I've failed by becoming too consumed with a project, too invested in a project, where I'm spending all of my time doing that, not enough time with my wife, not enough time with my kids, not enough time with other important things, those are not joyful moments.
Yeah.
Right? When I look back at those moments, I don't. Like, I wasn't living joyfully when I sort of became consumed. It's not joyful to be consumed by the project, right? And to develop this sort of like single-minded focus, because you're not being present in so many other avenues, and you're not even really being present with yourself, right? There is only the work, and there is nothing else. And I don't think that's artistically healthy, right? I think we need to be present and aware of our own kind of creative state. And there are unhealthy creative states that can look a lot like addiction.
Yeah.
And those unhealthy creative addictive states, they're not joyful states.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I've been in some of those in the past, and it's important to break out of those. And I think you can break out of those by honestly saying, okay, what would make me joyful right now? Probably not another 2 hours focused on this. So maybe I need to step away and go live the kind of life that writer after writer after writer has talked about, right? Put down the pen and now go live your life.
Yeah.
At some point.
I love that.
Yeah, question, Josh. Just as far as, because it seems like, I mean, from what you said, it's fairly recent that you started publishing these horror books for children.
Yeah.
Have you always written? Have you always written for kids? Have you always written horror? Is this just something that you decided, hey, I'm good at this. This is something I want to take a crack at, like recently? Or, and also, in addition to that, how has, since if you hadn't really done that previously, how has this new amount of work that you've kind of put on your plate, how do you, you know, you already talked about balance and everything, but how has that kind of changed everything?
Well, I've wanted to be a writer for as long as I can remember. Right, I remember the first movie I ever saw in the theater was Superman, starring Christopher Reeve, and for me that was just like, I was 4 years old. My dad took me to the cheap theater, and I remember just being enamored of the really high ceilings in the movie theater and the candy counters. And then the opening of that movie, the credits sort of fly at you in this sort of blue. You guys probably know. And the movie just like blew my mind. I just thought it was the coolest thing ever.
Real quick, I actually did a video where I recreate the Kryptonite, because I had kind of the same experience. You talked about the concession thing, but I went there and they had little Kryptonite, and I begged my dad for it. He wouldn't get it because it was like a rock painted green. So I made a whole video about that experience, and my dad wouldn't get me that rock. So 40 years later, I'm gonna make that. I'm gonna make this rock. So, but it's funny because I had that same exact experience with.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
And then, so I fell in love with story at a really early age. Star Wars was another like kind of transformative story for me that I encountered. And then when I got old enough to read and learned that you could like get the same charge from stories that I got from like Superman and Star Wars and these sorts of things from books, that was a real game changer as well, right? I remember loving the Twilight Zone when I was a kid. I fell in love with one of the first books I remember falling in love with is Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury. Kind of all this creepy stuff, scary stories to tell in the dark, Alvin Schwartz. And I knew that I wanted to be a writer at a really young age. And then I went to college, and I'm a first generation college graduate. And what this meant is that I went to college with a really, really healthy respect for higher education, because nobody in my family had done that, right? In my direct line, I'm first generation college graduate. And so I was raised to see college education as this really noble, amazing thing. And what it meant was that I kind of believed everything that my professors taught me. And in the 1990s, one of the things that I was being taught again and again as an English major was that there's a certain kind of story which is the best kind of story. And it's contemporary literary fiction for adults, right? That's what you should be writing. No science fiction, no fantasy, no horror, contemporary literary fiction for adults. And I was a good student, and I wanted to be a good student. And so for a long time, I tried to write contemporary literary fiction for adults because I was told again and again and again, right? The academic world has a bias towards a certain kind of story and against other kinds of stories, right? Genre fiction is generally speaking in the academic world not as respected as literary fiction, as what we call literary fiction.
It's not that different with art school in a lot of cases where, if
really?
you're interested in comics and things like that, it not so, maybe not so much anymore, but
well, it used to be if you drew in an anime style or a comic style, they'd be like, well, this isn't fine art. Let's learn how to oil paint.
Yeah, even back when I was going to the illustration program I went to, it's like I remember it being a real nightmare to justify making a graphic novel, in an illustration program. It's like, no. But what's weird is if I was like, hey, I want to like illustrate spa parlor catalogs, it would be like, yeah, let's work on that. And it's like, well, what's the difference there? Like, anyhow, sorry, go ahead.
So many of the creative writing classes I took when I was a student, and I have a Master's of Fine Arts in creative writing, and we kind of had this rule.
Nice.
In the creative writing classes that I took, which was, in this class, you will write literary fiction, right? You won't write genre fiction in this class. So I didn't write any horror when I was in my Master's of Fine Arts degree in creative writing, I didn't write any horror when I was in my undergraduate work, and I kind of adopted this bias towards a certain kind of story. And I had to unlearn that bias. And so for a long time, I wrote for adults. I edited a literary journal for a couple of years. I published a handful of stories that were, written as contemporary literary fiction for adults. But it wasn't until, kind of going back to the story of the two boys named Jacob in my scout troop, reading stories to those kids at scout camp, I felt like I kind of started to wake up again and remember why I fell in love with stories in the first place. Right? I mean, I'm an English professor today, and so I love The Great Gatsby. I love The Scarlet Letter. Classic literature worked for me. But this other thing really worked for me. And reading these stories to these boys kind of started to wake me up to that a little bit more and remind me that, like, this was sort of my passion. And this is kind of what got me into this. And then when those boys said, will you write, why don't you read us a story that you wrote? I ended up writing a story for these boys in my scout troop, took it up to scout camp, read them the story, and then another boy in the scout troop said, write a story about me. So I wrote a story about this other boy in the scout troop, and then it just kind of became this thing. My wife taught piano lessons to the kids in the neighborhood, and one day a girl in the neighborhood said, I hear you're writing stories for all the boys in the neighborhood. I said, yeah, that's true. And she said, wasn't that kind of sexist? And I was like, well, that's a good point. So I started writing stories about the girls, or the girls in the neighborhood, And like, again, I just kind of woke up. Is what it really felt like, an awakening to me, where I was like, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. These are the kind of stories I was put here to tell. And I made this shift away from the kind of stories that the academic world wanted me to write, and started writing the kind of things that I wanted to write. And what felt even better about that was that I was writing them as a gift to actual people that I cared about. And when I feel like my writing got a lot better when it stopped being about, I want to see my name on the cover of a book, and turned into, I want to make a gift for a real person, and I want it to be a good gift. Right? Once writing becomes not about the author, but when it becomes about the audience, I think we level up. Right? We sort of level up as artists when we start focusing on our art as a gift.
That's a
what was the question?
No, I think I was just interested in kind of how you decided, it's like later on in life, or if you had been writing other material previous to that, and you switched to children's literature, or just now you just started producing these books, and in a short amount of time you already have how many books? You said you have 2, but you got another one.
2 with one coming
out, which is pretty prolific for the time span. So how has that changed your life as far as now, in addition to day job, family, you also have this whole other thing? Or maybe
Well, I always spent time writing. Oh, and I want to give a caveat here before I go on and say, I am really grateful for the formal training I received. I learned a lot about craft. I learned a lot about storytelling. I do lament the academic world's bias against the kind of stories that I write today. But I'm really grateful for the training that I received. And I'm a better writer of horror because of that training that I received. Now, the way that becoming a published author has kind of like reshaped my day-to-day life, I always spent time writing. For a long, long time, I write about 3 pages a day, and I've kind of done that every day for a really long time. That's sort of my daily writing goal. I write 3 pages every day. And that's kind of been going on for a long time. But what's become more challenging is the amount of time that I spend doing events. The amount of time I spend doing signings and school visits and speaking at conferences and getting invited to speak at book groups and getting invited to speak at like to meet with writing groups and speak at like writers retreats and these kind of things. It's the public facing stuff that surprised me just how time consuming that can be. Right? I mean, I enjoy all of that stuff, but I kind of have to guard against how much public facing stuff I do because it can encroach upon the work itself. It feels like writing, but it's not. Right?
Yeah.
It's public facing stuff. It feels like you're writing, but you're not, because only writing counts as writing. Talking about your writing isn't writing. Meeting with people to talk about writing isn't writing. Signing books isn't writing. It all feels like writing, but it isn't. And so it encroaches on that a little bit. So I have to be really protective of my public facing time. And I think probably every writer probably experiences this. I saw Scott nodding as I was talking about that.
I was just because I know Josh has talked about that a lot. Like, if you're just talking about doing art, but you're not doing anything, are you really an artist? Or, it's same with writing.
Yeah, I'm one of those people of the philosophy that, like, this is how I hold myself to. It's like, I can call myself a cartoonist if I worked on cartooning today. If I didn't work on cartooning tomorrow, I'm not a cartoonist that day. I'm not going to, like, walk around pretending I'm a cartoonist unless I earned it for the day. And I feel like it's like that with writing, too. So it's kind of neat take. But I also love the idea of protecting your time and not getting so engrossed, because it is, a lot of writing is promotion too. Like, you do have to hustle for your books and stuff like that, and books don't sell themselves, unfortunately. And so it's like that is a real struggle, and I love the idea of making sure you kind of keep a little bit of that time secret, that you're not losing the whole thing in the first place, right?
That public-facing time is also, it's really tempting to go do these events because it sort of feeds your ego a little bit, right? Mm-hmm. When you get to show up and be like the writer in the room that everybody listens to. So, and if you're not careful, like if you're not guarded about that public-facing time, like I feel like it can harm the work because. Right, that ego stroking is bad for art, I think, and so you need to be guarded about it because of the time that it takes away from doing the work. You need to be guarded about it because of what it could turn you into if you're not careful.
Yeah, that's interesting. That idea of adulation as poison is kind of interesting to the creative soul. Well, we're a little over an hour. This has been great. But any closing thoughts or anything, Josh?
Oh, I just want to say thanks. This is fun stuff. Getting together, talking with smart people about things that I love. Yeah,
man.
This has been a gas.
Hey, anytime you want to come on, just shoot me a note. We'll have you on. That'd be fun.
Oh, I'll come back whenever you want me.
Cool.
Yeah, my son is about a year or two away from the age range you're writing for, so I cannot wait. I think I'm gonna get him into this because he likes horror for kids. So
yeah, he'll like it. They're fun. Where can people go to get your stuff, Josh? Where can they go to get the books?
The books they're pretty much available like wherever books are sold. You can get them at Barnes and Noble. You can get them, IndieBound, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. The books are available. Just kind of they're out there. It's pretty much wherever books are sold.
Great. Okay, and Joshua Kimble, where can people find your stuff?
So you can get Jacob's Apartment or Two Stories, the two books that I have out, 2 graphic novels, and then also you can make sure you subscribe to the channel on YouTube, Joshua Kimble. Yeah.
It's awesome.
Especially if you want to see a 6-string banjo. A 6-string banjo.
Ooh, that's fun. If you want to find my stuff, you can go to CoreyKerr.com and jump onto the Substack there. So you can see what I think would happen if time slowly started to break down and stop functioning correctly. There's one coming up that I think will be a little bit catastrophic. But a quarter of the world dies in the first couple sentences of that chapter. So go check that out, and you can see some of the comics and animations that I've done at my website as well. And Scott, where can we find your stuff, and how do we keep track of whose channel this show is on?
Yeah, you can find a number of things at my website, circworks.com. That includes my comics, like my comic book Young and the Dead. It's a kids versus zombie adventure story, like Goonies meets Night of the Living Dead. Plus, I've got digital products to help you make comics. I've got wax packs, all kinds of crazy stuff that I'm making over on my YouTube channel, which is Circworks on YouTube, or Circworks Art Labs on YouTube. Definitely check that out. I've got a new video dropping tomorrow, which I'm super excited about. So check that out. And just remember, if you happen to be in Arizona on May 4th, Star Wars Day, Free Comic Book Day, I'll be signing comics and doing sketches and stuff at Surprise Comics in Surprise, Arizona. And this show, the Artcasters, we do this show every single week. It rotates between our three channels. We have different guests usually every week. We have a different topic. So it can get a little confusing as far as whose channel it's on and everything. So if you want to know exactly, you want all that information in one succinct place, just join our mailing list. We don't spam you or anything. All we do is about 30 minutes before we go live, we'll send you a link so you know what channel it is, who the guest is going to be, and all that stuff. Real easy. Like I said, we don't spam or anything. That's all it's for, is just to notify you. So definitely sign up for that. There's a link in the description.
Okay. We'll see you guys later. Go make stuff.